Welcome back to Apocalypse here for another in brief video. Today we're going to be talking about an apocalyptic rereading of Romans 1 through 3. In the last in brief video, we made a sort of biographical move, which is to say that there's a group of Jewish Christian teachers running around Paul's communities in Galatia, Philippi, and Rome, causing trouble. But we need to address the stretch of texts where works of law, justification, faith are all combined in a systematic way, Romans 1 through 3. And the presence of the teacher will help us make sense of this in a way that is much more coherent, as far as I found, than any other approach. If the conventional reading is right, then I think we're just going to have to settle with Paul being fundamentally incoherent. But I don't think it is right. So remember, the teachers seem to have been preaching a gospel surrounding works of law, doing works of the law that is highly conditional and contractual. And we have evidence that these teachers, these same teachers that we talked about in relation to Galatians, were on their way to Rome around the spring of 52 CE. And Paul seems to have written Romans to get out in front of their arrival, since he could not be there in person. So see Romans 16, 17 through 19. Now, when read in a certain way, we can see what these teachers were actually preaching in Paul's rhetorical engagement with them in Romans 1 through 3. It's as if Paul is saying to the Roman Christians that he's writing to, if a guy walks through the door and starts talking like this, here's why you shouldn't listen to him. I'm going to show you why. So what does Paul suppose the teacher or teachers were set to preach in Rome, and how does he respond? Move 1, the teacher's opening in Romans 1:18 to 32. So the claim for the apocalyptic rereading, argued by Douglas Campbell in The Deliverance of God, is that Paul is speaking in the voice of one of these teachers. He does that in 1:18 through to verse 32, in order to then expose the tensions and contradictions within the teacher's position through chapter 2, finally putting the nail in the coffin in chapter 3. Campbell often calls this a Socratic reading of the stretch of text, setting up an opponent's position in order to respond to it on its own terms and expose its problems. Okay, and this way of writing and performing and engaging was a staple in the ancient world. It's a tactic that you would have learned at a very young age. Now, Andrew Relaire, who's at the King's University, his dissertation is all over this stuff, giving historical evidence of this going on in Paul's day and before and after. Now, the teacher's position in Romans 1:18 to 32, according to Paul, is that God's retributive wrath is aimed toward people for their transgressions. And this is just because everyone, can plainly know God and his expectations for them by looking at the cosmos. And the teacher is accusing people, in particular pagans, of suppressing this truth, leaving them without excuse for the judgment that is awaiting them. And this results in idolatry, as the text talk about, substituting in created things for God. God gives them up to what they're desiring, leading to unnatural sexual behavior, and a descent into this sort of tidal wave of resulting vices. Because of the seriousness of this suppression, rejection, indulgence in various idolatrous and immoral practices, the divine death penalty is the response on God's part. Now, in response to this position, we have a sudden turn in Romans 2:1, where Paul's takedown of this teacher begins. So move 2, Romans 2:1 to 8, turning on the teacher. What Paul does first is point out that the teacher did not actually include himself in the opening indictment. It's like seeing someone on social media holding people to a certain standard and then commenting, hey, shouldn't you also hold yourself to the same standard instead of simply condemning others? So Paul's initial move in response to the teacher is to widen the scope of the teacher's indictment and apply it to everybody, including the teacher himself, and then shows what happens, okay? And it shows that damnation and hence salvation for anyone are based strictly on what one does, on works. It's desert-based. Disobedience leads to death, and implicitly obedience leads to life, salvation, right? But this obviously needs to be applied fairly. Consistent wrongdoers get condemned to death, and doers of good get called righteous and get a lot of cool stuff in heaven. So Paul reveals in the teacher's own thinking that salvation and damnation are based on one's works. Paul now can turn to show how this leads to some really embarrassing implications for the teacher's own program. Next move 3, Romans 2:9-29. Sort of embarrassment that happens here. What Paul now exposes is that according to the teacher's own thinking, pagans already have an inherent law in the light of which they're going to be judged, or can be judged. The first humiliating result of this is that disobedient Jewish people will be judged and condemned according to the written Torah. So simply being a Torah-observant Jewish Christian is not going to actually protect you if you don't actually do God's dictates, if you don't obey them. Paul has effectively removed any distinction between Jews and pagans in the teacher's thinking. There is simply no need at this point in the teacher's own program for pagans to actually adopt the written Jewish Torah. Why? Because they already possess a law, like the teacher said, that gives them the sufficient information to be saved or damned. And remember, this would undercut the teacher's commitment that we've talked about in previous videos for the necessity of works of the written Torah for salvation. But things get worse for the teacher. Paul goes on to point out that even the most outlandish sins can still happen, even when one possesses the written Torah. There's a lot more on this in the text, but just for the sake of brevity. In fact, pagans have the necessary information as pagans, according to the teacher's own position, to be declared righteous. They can get saved by the innate law that they can read on their own hearts or by observing the cosmos. So it follows that a righteous pagan can then essentially humiliate an unfaithful Jewish person who has the written Torah on the day of judgment, at which point faithful pagans would be considered the true Jews, according to the teacher's basic commitments, without actually needing the written Torah. So the teachers accidentally undermined the importance and specialness of the Jewish Christian Torah observance in general, and circumcision in particular, for pagans, the very people he would want to persuade to follow the written Torah in the first place. Move 4, 3:1-20, the nail in the coffin. So Paul is now engaging directly with the teacher, having seemingly already broken down his position. One of Paul's goals in this section, this sort of dialogue section, is to move the teacher to admit that circumcision and the written Torah do not guarantee an ethical or saving advantage, because implied in the teacher's own thinking, if a Jewish person sins, they will endure the crushing justice of God, just like everyone else. So Paul depicts the teacher initially as if he hasn't really been paying attention to what Paul's been saying, and the teacher asserts quite boldly that Torah-observant Jews still enjoy an advantage in many respects. So Paul changes his argument and the tactic for this ever so slightly. He asks the teacher whether God's standards of judgment are going to be relaxed if and when Torah-observant Jews sin. If the faithless person were to receive an advantage and thus evade God's judgment, then God's justice and divine character would have to be abandoned altogether. So faced with this slightly different approach by Paul, the teacher responds with an emphatic, "By no means, hell no." Paul then asks the teacher whether sinful deeds will invalidate God's justice in accordance with his character. The answer, of course, is no. God's judgment will not waver in relation to sinful deeds, and in fact, those who suggest this are themselves condemned. Now, the result of this conversation and this final back and forth between the two interlocutors is that the teacher ends up giving a contradictory answer to the one he gave in response to Paul's initial question in verse 1. What then is the advantage of the Jew, or what benefit is circumcision? What's the advantage? Much in every way. What does the teacher say now at the end of this dialogue? No, not at all. What's happened here is that the teacher has been forced to admit that no advantage in terms of salvation actually exists, whether presently or on the day of judgment, for anyone in a sinful position. There is no valid ground to suggest that God modifies God's character as the good judge. So having heard this admission from the mouth of the teacher, Paul makes his concluding argumentative move about universal human sinfulness in 3:9b-20. This eliminates any remaining optimism that the teacher and those persuaded by him may have. Now, remember back in Romans 1:18-32, in the teacher's opening. There, the teacher suggests that knowledge of God is accessible to everyone and understood and seen through the things that God has made. Paul now suggests here, contrary to the teacher's foundational claim concerning universal accessibility of knowledge of God, that in fact, nobody understands God. No one seeks God. right? 3:11. It follows that no human being will be declared righteous in God's sight by deeds prescribed by the Torah. That is, no one will be saved by following the teacher's gospel. So it's 3:20a. Using the teacher's own logic, Paul has shown that the teacher's program fails miserably since Gentiles, pagans, do not actually need to follow the Jewish Torah in order to be saved. In fact, if God is truly just and humanity, including Jewish people, are involved in sin in some way, then the teacher's gospel of works through Torah observance simply will not save anybody. The teacher is now silenced. His program is not just flawed, it is fundamentally false. It is, to reiterate what Paul said in Galatians 1:7, no gospel at all. So I'm going to link a longer version of this that I did a couple years ago, I think. It's in 2 parts. It gets in a little bit more detail. If you want to get really, really into detail, my suggestion would be to read the OG thing, The Deliverance of God, an apocalyptic rereading of Justification in Paul by Douglas Campbell. It's pretty long, but if you have the patience to get through it, I think it's worth it. I'll have some of this Socratic stuff included in the book I'm working on with Douglas that will hopefully be out next year. But with that, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section. I know this was really kind of a flyover. If you have any detailed questions, I'm happy to answer those. Please like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. And with that, this has been Apocalypse here, Christianity you can live with.